We are here, of course, for our House Bill 3610 Task Force meeting. And today is March 14th. My God, the time has slipped by me very, very quickly. Amazing. Anyway, we have a pretty full agenda today, although I think we have a few people missing that we thought we were going to have. So I just want to identify that. Ebony Clark was supposed to be with us from the Oregon Health Authority. Unfortunately, she will not be able to be with us. Or Samantha DuPont from OHA. Not sure what is that about, maybe illness or just duties?
Yeah, Judy.
Okay, fabulous. Well, it happened. So I'd like to get a roll call going real quick so we make sure we know who's here and that we have a nice group here to form.
Director Prince.
Here.
Jamie Floyd. I think he said he's gonna be absent today.
Okay.
Marcus Reed.
Here.
Vaughn Berry. Okay.
Sure. I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Deanna McCamey.
Here.
Aaron Sarnoff Wood.
Here.
Jason Renaud. He said he's gonna be late today. Todd Jeter.
Here.
Dr. Tom Jean.
Here.
Annalise Dolph.
Here.
Danelle Romaine.
Here.
Sarah Lochner. She said she's gonna be absent as well. Rob Corbett.
Here.
John Colmer.
Here.
Solera Salazar.
Here.
Doug Barrett. I don't see him in the attendee list yet. Okay. Quorum is present.
Great, and legislators we have. There's Senator Solomon, anyone else? I'm not seeing, I can't see that far.
Rep Reschke.
Oh.
And Senator Knope.
They are here, fabulous. I appreciate you all making the time. I know that sometimes it's difficult, even post session, we have limits on our time. So on my agenda, I have a discussion of the 24 work plan. Did everyone get a chance to look at that? And are we going to put that up for the people to see it online just in case? Yeah.
Of course. One moment.
So as you know, we of course changed some of the dates around at the request of folks who were a little concerned about spring break and just overall timing of things in the world. So we have today's meeting and then rescheduling the March 28th to April 4th. And I think what they're wondering that we rescheduled yet. The 25th was removed and rescheduled to April 18th. So we're tightening up a little bit. April 4th, April 11th, and April 18th, one right after the other. But again, if it's as necessary, so we can get to what we need to. Did folks get a chance to look through the work plans at all? Have questions or concerns?
Do we have the revisions? I know I talked to you about them, but
Yeah, and we were going to wait until after this
Okay.
meeting so we can send it out, just making sure everyone's okay with the changes.
do you mind just going back to, I'm just seeing what's on the agendas for the different, just so I know when we're presenting. So OLCC on the floor.
Yeah.
On the 11th,
Is the OHA,
OHA.
so OHA will
CPO.
be coming back to do their full
Right.
report.
CCOs, local public health authorities, Sarah Lochner, conference on local health officials, county mental health providers, so Cheryl Ramirez, Association of County Mental Health Providers, tribal health providers, Doug Barrett, Confederate Tribes of Kuslo, Rumpon, Sayusala, and all pricing task force member. That's what we have on the agenda for the field trip. And then the 25th, or sorry, the 18th, OHA's report on the Fed investments and cost estimates for addressing unmet needs, comprehensive overview of the 2024 Fed financial analysis, HB 5006, part 2, inspired OHA behavioral health, spotlight strategies, investments and gaps across the continuum with speakers representing prevention, harm reduction, and treatment. And then, of course, May 2nd is the wine presentation, 16th is then wine beer cider presentation, beer distribution cider. There's a 28th scheduled, and just, I think we originally had the 30th on there, but because we're in ledge days at that point in time, we thought we would try to get that one scheduled a little better within, the legislature time, so that is the time for, task force and that type of thing. Through the 28th, we so that the second panel presentation, highlighting some of the other system, really designated trucks. Is that? We'll fix that. And tribal survey of organizations, Julie Johnson, OHA, Caroline Cruz, culturally specific CDOs, and people with lived experience in substance use disorder. That's what we have on the agenda thus far. Questions?
I'm sorry, do you mind just going back to me that I just didn't see? So May 2nd is when we start the industry side.
Yes.
1 to 3.
May 2nd and 16th.
This is for Adam, whether we have a guest Wi-Fi password.
Oh. It's,
Well, yeah, folks need to pull that up. I don't know, do folks need the Wi-Fi password?
Sure.
It's GU3. Actually, are we recording?
yes.
I'll write it down.
Burn it immediately after.
Pass it around.
Right.
Zero or
Zero. Yeah, LCC.
What's the network name? Do you remember?
Any questions?
I think that's it.
Well, I was just looking at
Yes,
the
the
industry
Yeah,
side,
the
just to
actual
figure out.
network name.
It's Canada.
So are you thinking that we don't need one full, meeting for, specifically for wine? Do we want to,
I don't
mix it up a
know.
bit? Is that what we're thinking?
Well, we have the 2 days to cover
Oh,
beer.
so maybe we just keep them both.
Okay,
Everything
so-
for both, and we can figure it out amongst
Right,
ourselves.
2 days are 2 and 5.
2 and 5, 6.
5/16.
2 and the 16th. I have just one request, if it works for others, about whether it's possible to do a morning meeting, and maybe it's not. Do you have an OLCC meeting that morning? On the 2nd?
On the
Instead of,
second, we should not. On the 16th, let me check.
The 16th.
Right, that could be
Then maybe this is the problem for others, so I don't want to create other problems, but.
I'm sorry, the question is doing it in the morning rather than
On
the
the
afternoon?
2nd, I know I have a conflict on May 2nd in the afternoon, but
Okay.
maybe that isn't a conflict for others, but. I'd like to be here,
Yeah, we'll have, this will be available.
like at 10 to 12 instead of if that's at all possible.
and we will, make sure, everyone in the office knows, so.
Would that create a problem for anyone else to do the morning on the 2nd?
Well, not desperately, I can rearrange a few things, that big of a deal.
Okay, thank you.
Just standing meeting.
Okay.
Okay, we good? Are we good with the work plan thus far? Okay, let's move on. I want to go over, just a quick review of the questionnaire. I'm not sure, did we plan on getting all of this out in bigger form or much more produced form?
Actually, on the website,
Yeah.
there's the OLCC.
Okay. So We went over it.
Executive chair.
I'm sorry.
Is that the end of the meetings then, on the 16th? Is that the last meeting?
Oh, no.
Oh, no, then there's more.
No, we just haven't planned them all out yet.
Got it, okay.
No, we just haven't.
Really?
And so as I said, the May 16th and then the 28th, that would be during legislative days at the Capitol, hopefully. And then we've got other ones scheduled for June 13th, June 27th. Well, August 1st, I said no, because it's just to be here. The 15th, 29th of August, and then of course the report is due. So we have those times there available to us if we need more time and want to have more sort of deeper discussion about things. And we haven't laid all of that out yet because we don't, we want to see where we get to from here. Like we're laying out all of the information as best we can right now to give everybody a chance to sort of hear what we need to hear and then have more conversation afterwards. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Good now? All right, thank you. So I just want to talk a little, just briefly about the questionnaire. So of course, the results are on the website or
Yes.
the comments and things. We went over those briefly this morning and I just have to say that it was really amazing to read through some of the comments and some of the, the things that addressed just the questions in general. I'm very impressed that people really took the time to be very thoughtful about their responses. And also want to just maybe recognize that we are closer than we appear, maybe in our own mind. We are honestly closer than we appear. And that's not always easy. It really is not always easy to, we don't all think exactly the same, but at least we're all recognizing we have struggles, issues, and we want to come up with some ways to manage things. So I just want to appreciate that, first of all. I don't know if people want to go through any of the details of this. I don't know that we need to unless if anyone has any questions about it. Did you get a chance to look at it? Okay. I haven't looked at I've read through a few of them and glanced through a lot of the answers. Again, really thoughtful responses to the questions that were asked.
Is that posted on the, it's an email?
It's generalized, posted on the website. We gathered the names off, of course, so the names are not available. We'll double check and just make sure that they're on the website, but yeah, we posted them. It is there, yeah.
Questions? So if people, I take it that people haven't had a chance to really dig into them. I want to give you that opportunity before we have any more discussion about them. But again, just want to acknowledge that I just think it's such an amazing thing that people took such great care in their responses and just to recognize we are definitely closer here. Thank you. So let's move forward and look at that. We might actually be close to on time. Dr. Andrew Dyke, Senior Analyst and Partner with the Northwest.
I think he's going to be presenting.
He's going to be online. Okay, fabulous. We're going to start with you, Dr. Dyke. Where are you?
Great, thank you. I'm not sure if I can open my camera up. Apologies for not being able to be there in person. And one of the consequences of that is that you'll have to bear with me for a few seconds while I struggle to try to share my screen. Give me 1 second here.
You are extremely pixelated there.
Uh-oh, that's not a good sign.
Coming together. Very good.
Okay, so that's something I'm assembling. What I'm struggling with here is sharing my screen. So I think, Adam, you said you had the presentation queued up. Is that still?
I do.
Let's go with that. I'm actually on a loaner laptop as well, so the settings aren't quite right. And apologize for that inconvenience as well. But as Adam's bringing that up, I'll say a couple of things. So that's going to present some highlights from a study we completed for OHA a couple of years ago, actually, and we're actually nearing the 5th anniversary in a few months of when we started talking to OHA about doing the study, circa late 2019. Since then, obviously, the pandemic happened and so on. So about 5 years in. Almost all the data and information that I'll be presenting today will be current as of about 2019, so a few years old. And since then, as you all know, I'm sure, alcohol consumption behaviors have been evolving through the pandemic and into today. There has been emerging research, new research on some of the questions I'll be touching on as we're moving through the presentation. But I would say nothing that would dramatically change our conclusions. The particulars, if we were to do this analysis today, the numbers would be a little different, but in terms of the magnitude of the harm caused by excessive alcohol consumption, probably not going to be very different. The effect of a tax increase on consumption also probably not very different. And do you have the PowerPoint up actually?
Yes. Yes.
I have it in PDF. I don't have the PowerPoint.
That's fine. Yep. So bottom line there, right? The data, it's starting to get dated, but I think the conclusions are going to be very similar and not different were we to update the study today. So the first slide, when it appears, just want to talk a little bit about the.
This is the study. not-
Oh.
This is the study, not the PowerPoint. We're going to the PowerPoint.
Oh, one moment.
And again, apologize. Oh, I can see myself pixelated. So probably better that I'm not presenting the slides because it probably would not be legible there. Again, apologies for that. So, and as that's coming up, I just a couple more comments. Happy to take questions as I'm moving through. I think we have some Q&A time at the scheduled end of the presentation. Happy to take them there as well. I will try to focus on the findings and not so much on the weeds of the methodology. Again, happy to take questions on methodology, but do want to focus on the findings and the recommendations that we came to. There is a broader report, as you were just looking at. It has a lot more information on what we did and how we did it, but we'll focus today on what we found primarily.
Okay.
There we go. Excellent. Okay. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so, yep, perfect. Thank you. So we can flip to the next slide there. So just basically, again, mentioned, we started talking to OHA about this almost 5 years ago. And what they asked us to do was to explore the effect of raising alcohol excise taxes on beer and wine in a fairly specific way, which I'll define in a few slides. But also to do some additional analysis that will help understand the effects of that tax increase. And so what we looked at in terms of the effects were, one, tax revenue. Obviously, if we change the price of alcohol through a tax, that's going to affect revenue in some way. And one of the things we have to consider is how prices, as they're affected by taxes, change consumption as well, because that obviously has a big impact on the revenue that would be generated or not based on a tax increase. And then finally, not just to look at the dollars and cents, but in dollars and cents, look at how a price increase generated by a tax increase might affect the harms caused by excessive consumption of alcohol. And so I'm going to talk about these things almost in reverse order, but those are sort of the three components of what the study looked at. And we can now, and an important note on the lower left there, we did analysis based on the existing tax structure and a very specific tax scenario. It was not a comprehensive analysis of all of the possible ways that we might think about modifying or attempting to change behavior regarding alcohol consumption and or changing or addressing the harms caused by excessive alcohol consumption. And that's more what the task force are addressing that broader question. So next slide, please. So I do want to pause again on some definitions, and I think you've seen the state epidemiologist, Dr. Seidlinger, rattle these off, but just so that we're clear on what we're talking about. When we're measuring the harm or trying to estimate the harm caused by excessive alcohol consumption, we're using some fairly specific definitions tied to surveys of individual behavior and the science on the harms that are caused. What we mean by excessive consumption are one of three things, or any or all of three things. One, excessive drinking, which includes binge drinking, which includes heavy drinking, and any drinking by pregnant women or people younger than age 21. And we define binge drinking specifically as someone drinking 4 or more standard sized drinks per occasion for a woman, 5 or more drinks for a man. Similar, but a little bit different. We define heavy drinking, consistent with the CDC, OHA, and others, as 8 or more drinks per week and for a woman, and 15 or more drinks per week for a man. And so I think, again, you've seen those definitions, but just did want to put them back up on the slides here. Okay, so moving to the next slide. So just a couple of comments here. Again, the big picture question was, what are the implications of a tax increase on alcohol? And to really get at that question effectively, it's important to consider all the costs and benefits associated with the change. And that's the revenue raised, the reduction in consumption, which leads to changes in health, changes in the burden caused by excessive consumption. And so to the best of our ability, we tried to quantify all of the major categories that we could identify associated with that specific question. And it's important to note that we're going beyond just the cost paid by consumers at the cash register and beyond treatment for, say, alcohol use disorder. There are a lot of public costs imposed on others and that the individual imposes on themselves associated with alcohol consumption that are not captured in those two categories. I'll give you some more detail on those. But in general, we looked at lost earnings because people are less productive at work, because they don't show up to work, because people die early due to excessive alcohol consumption. And on the business side, similarly, there are impacts of workers not showing up or not being productive. And so we captured that, as well as the public costs to a wide variety of categories, including the criminal justice system, healthcare, et cetera. And if you can move to the next slide. These public costs are very important, and you'll see a large share of the total cost that we estimate for excessive consumption. But what this slide's showing is just some survey data that talks about the prevalence of certain impacts of excessive alcohol use. This is not the dollars and cents, and these are just examples. It's not a comprehensive listing of everything. But for example, 44% of the US population reports having been a passenger with a driver who's had too much to drink. Ultimately, that leads to things like motor vehicle accidents. You can see that 8.1%, for example, of the population has been in a motor vehicle accident because of someone else's drinking. And there are other examples up and down. Main point here, though, is that excessive alcohol use is fairly highly prevalent across the population and has big impacts on others as well as the consumer themselves. Okay, so next slide. The harm, the excess burden, is distributed unequally across subpopulations. You may have seen a slide similar to this before as well from the state epidemiologist or OHA. But what this slide is showing is alcohol-related death rates by race and ethnicity in Oregon. This is average across 2014 to 2017. And you can see that the rates are very different across populations, with American Indian, Alaska Native death rates much higher than for any other racial or ethnic group identified in the chart, over twice the statewide average. And the next slide sort of digs into that a little bit more, which we can turn to. And the harm, even to individuals, that we can attribute to alcohol is not necessarily directly tied to the amount of consumption. I have a quote from a researcher in this area. The common finding in the field that people with higher socioeconomic status, higher income, may consume as much or more alcohol than people of lower socioeconomic status. But the lower SES populations bear a disproportionately greater burden of the negative consequences of alcohol consumption. The little diagram on the right illustrates we've identified a number of factors: housing instability, lack of access to the labor market, limited employment opportunities, limited social networks, limited access to health care. These are all factors that disproportionately affect BIPOC populations, low income populations, and they're all factors that can exacerbate the harms caused by alcohol. And point being, if you could have two individuals consuming the same amount and they will experience different personal harms as a result of that, you can have two individuals associated with people consuming too much alcohol or excessive amounts of alcohol, and they will experience potentially different amounts of harm associated with that. And these are critical questions when evaluating policy changes designed to affect behavior, to affect the harms. Next slide. And probably not surprisingly, harms are distributed differentially across geography as well. This map shows similar metric as in the bar chart, but this is death rates by county attributable to alcohol. not perfect, but pretty clear pattern where we see higher death rates in the southwest and south of the state, and to some extent up in the northeast, lower rates of death. You see particularly in Washington County, the more populous, Portland metro area. So again, important to consider these differences in both consumption and harm associated with alcohol in evaluating any policy change. And I will say the data are not up to very precise modeling. We were not able to say Malheur County has this amount of burden versus Multnomah County. So there are some limits, but it's important to recognize the diversity of effects.
Excuse me, Dr. Dyke, can you hold on for just 1 second?
Dr. Dyke, it's Craig Prince. It's good to see you. I haven't seen you in a long time, so I didn't recognize you when you were there. So hi, Andy.
Hello, it's been a while, yes.
It's been a long time. This is a question, I think it's really a Dr. Dean. I'm trying to keep the definitions.
Mhm.
Alcohol attributable, was that the definition that included kind of those? What are the two terms you used, Doctor, on the last one?
I mean, there's an alcohol attributable fraction that where we look at certain cancer deaths
Yeah.
and other pieces, some motor vehicles and other pieces where alcohol is a contributing factor. Those get added to alcohol induced.
Alcohol induced,
That's which is what we would think of as the truly caused alcohol, like cirrhosis.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to make sure I remembered alcohol induced and alcohol.
This would be the total.
Thank
Yep,
you.
This would be both. Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. And we did put in some time at the end for questions.
Okay, thanks.
I wanted you to get to
You're
that.
right. I'm sorry.
Looks like you're really clear, but I have a question about that really dark spot right there.
Mhm.
Which we'll play on, but
Well, and I can't speak to this, specifics of death rates, but there is inevitably with much smaller populations, the possibility that we see something that looks very dramatic when it might be a year. I mean, this is multiple years, but it could still be a year-to-year fluctuation. That said, that there could be something going on, that's very different in those counties.
it's very possible. I would also look at it from the perspective of someone who's actually done research in terms of population base and capacity for like things like emergency services and whatnot. When you have limited access to those types of things, you experience a higher death rate because of accident-related issues.
So yeah, and I would throw geography to some extent into that prior slide, which just sort of illustrating, housing instability, lack of access to medical care. You're in a remote Oregon, you don't have that access, and clearly could be playing a role there. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is the big picture number we came up with, and I'll spend a couple of minutes describing how we got there. But first, we'll say for 2019, we estimated the economic burden of excessive alcohol use to be $4.8 billion. That's as of 2019, that was about the size of Corvallis's economy. At the time, American Express, Delta, Airbnb all had market valuations of about that, not small companies. So these are big costs. And again, we might get different numbers today, but they're not going to be dramatically different. In terms of how we got there, I think we just mentioned, Dr. Segler just mentioned the alcohol attributable fraction. We did a lot of work to collect all the best research on alcohol attributable fractions across a wide range of costs, from healthcare to criminal justice expenditures, et cetera. What share of all motor vehicles accidents are caused by alcohol use or associated with excessive alcohol use, and so on. And looked category by category, used the best evidence we could find on what share of an expenditure total or an incidence rate was attributable to alcohol, and added them up and got to this $4.8 billion. As you can see, more than half of the costs are what we would call public costs, and I'll talk a little bit more about specifically what's in that category. That's $2.6 billion. The remainder were private costs, and these are the lost earnings due to limited or reduced worker productivity, worker mortality, et cetera. So big picture number of that $4.8 billion, and that's what we'll be thinking about for the next couple of slides. We can go to the next slide here. So how big is $4.8 billion? Again, it's the size of Corvallis in 2019. It was, as of 2019, $1,100 per person in the state, 2% of state GDP. So again, big number. On the right, we break that down into some of the larger categories we looked at. There's that $2.2 billion associated with lost labor productivity, $1.3 billion associated with criminal justice costs. These are, jail and prison expenditures, police arrests, motor vehicle crashes, as well as costs imposed on victims, legal expenses, although that's a very tiny category, and some other things. $702 million imposed on the healthcare system, and then about $600 million in education and social welfare. The report has a lot more detail on specifically what's behind that. I'll give you a few more numbers in the next slide, but that's sort of the big picture, what we're looking at. So next slide. So again, breaking it up in a different way, 1/3 of costs were imposed on victims of excessive alcohol use, and I'll rephrase the words there a little bit. They are either imposed directly on the victims or associated with services received by victims of excessive alcohol use. In the upper left, we estimated about almost $750 million associated with fetal alcohol syndrome. The individuals affected by FAS impose a relatively large burden on the healthcare system. That's most of that $750 million, but also the education system through the need for special education services. We can come back to these numbers or peel them apart a little bit more if you want to, but we can pull them apart and you can see the bigger categories there. But in the interest of time, I will move to the next slide. Okay, so we have that in the background. We have a burden of about $4.8 billion in 2019. The overarching question, though, was what would happen under a specific excise tax scenario. And what that scenario was what would happen if Oregon imposed an additional 5 cents per standard drink on beer, wine, and cider in Oregon. And look at this, the same three things we've already talked about: tax revenue, behavioral change and consumption, as well as what share of the harms that we just talked about might be mitigated by an increase of this magnitude. And so this was another data collection and analysis phase of the study. We really wanted to know, what does the evidence say about the effects of that price increase? And we can move to the next slide and talk about one of the most important parameters, which is the price sensitivity. How much do people's consumption behaviors change associated with a given price increase? And the answer, again, the research will have a variety of specific numbers, but the general conclusion is pretty consistent. Not surprisingly, the heaviest drinkers are the least responsive to price increases. And as a point of context, the top 10% of drinkers consume about half of all alcohol. So if you're not changing the behavior of that top 10%, you're probably not changing consumption overall all that much, although there are some populations that will respond more heavily to a price increase. And that's what this chart shows. We're looking at the distribution of drinkers from the least intensive bottom 25% of adults in terms of consumption, up to the top 5% heaviest drinkers who actually still consume a very highly disproportionate share of the total alcohol. And you can see for that bottom quartile, bottom 25% of drinkers, a 10% increase in alcohol prices would reduce consumption by 7%. And as an economist, we would still call that relatively insensitive because the percent change in consumption is less than the price increase. But that's, they're getting close to being on par. Whereas if we move up to that top 10th percentile decile, we'd only expect a reduction of about 2.3%, a fraction of the overall price increase. And so for context, the price increase we were talking about for this specific scenario worked out at the time to about 5% price increase for beer and cider, and 2 to 3% for a standard drink of wine. And notably, 0% change in the price of spirits, which I'll mention again in a bit. So we can move to the next slide. As with consumption, price sensitivity is going to vary across subgroups, and we're extrapolating a little bit in that this chart is showing the prevalence of binge drinking and heavy drinking across race and ethnicity. But if we believe, and we do, that heavier consumers of alcohol are less responsive to prices, this difference in behavior across races and ethnicities suggests differential responses to a price increase. And we included these factors in our modeling, and you'll see how that plays out in a couple of slides. Okay, so next slide, please.
Interesting.
This is a repeat here. Another map. This is just showing the same thing as before, but just noting that there's a likely correlation to some extent between consumption and geography, although some of what we're seeing here is related to other factors, factors other than consumption.
Dr. Dyke, we have a question from the task force.
Yep.
Thank you, Dr. Dyke, Danelle Romaine from the Beer and Wine Distributors. I'm just curious about, this always confuses me about the price increase versus excise tax.
Mhm.
It looks like you maybe modeled the sales tax like a full, like an actual per drink tax, not an excise tax. Do you mind explaining what the model was? Just because the excise tax is on the business, not on the drink. I'm just curious.
Right. Yeah, well, so the price increase would, what we did model was a price increase, or an increase in the excise tax of 5 cents per standard drink. And that's a different proportionate increase for beer and wine. But the conclusion from the literature is, and the assumption we used in the model, is that those price increases are essentially passed directly through to the consumer. And there's some variation in literature findings in the literature on that point, but consensus is that the price increases do get passed straight through. Some research actually suggests that the price increase is even higher than the increase in tax, some a little bit lower. But for our modeling purposes, we assume that the price would be directly translated into consumer prices.
If I may, I'm in the industry and the tax is rolled into your cost of goods sold. And then you mark that up by your margin, and then your distributor marks it up by their margin, and then your retailer marks it up by their margin. A tax is usually 4 times larger in cost to the consumer than it is to the business being taxed. So $1 tax to me is $4 tax to the consumer, generally speaking, after those markups. Just as an example.
Right, yes.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Next, okay, yeah, next slide. Okay, so big picture conclusion, consumers are relatively insensitive to price changes, which is in some sense helpful for funding programs. You can raise money associated with a particular behavior and then fund them, but less useful for changing behavior. As you saw, a relatively large price increase is going to have a relatively small impact on consumption. Doing the calculations, though, we end up with an estimate of about $50 million raised through this modeled increase in the excise tax. Would likely be relatively stable. It's going to vary, obviously, with consumption into the pandemic and beyond. We've seen, until maybe very recently, increases in alcohol consumption. That trend might be turning around a little bit in the most recent year or so. But relatively stable and predictable revenue source until we see broader changes in societal behavior. Next slide. In terms of bottom line changes in consumption, these are what we would think are probably sort of the most we would expect to see. We might have seen consumption decrease by 4% overall in 2019 with respect to the modeled increase, and maybe 3% amongst the heaviest drinkers. But I would consider that upper bound based on the range of effects we're seeing in the literature. And there are reasons to think that we might see considerably less. We would expect to see differential effects across subgroups of consumers for a variety of reasons. Most importantly, perhaps, the differences in so-called risky behavior across populations. The evidence does not suggest that this kind of price increase has a dramatic effect on risky behaviors. That's not true across the board for every population. For example, price changes might have a stronger effect on underage drinking, but across the board where most consumption happens, would not expect a large change, which is not to say no change, but not a large change. In addition, I mentioned, we modeled an increase in the price of beer and wine and cider, assuming no change in the treatment of spirits. And so we would expect some substitution towards what becomes relatively cheaper spirits, which would reduce the overall effect on consumption.
Excuse me, Dr. Dyke, just 1 second,
Yep.
please.
Sorry, one point of clarification. In the report, it was a 20 cent per standard drink modeled for the findings that I think are being presented. Just trying to clarify, you said 5 cents, but that's what it indicates here, unless I have a wrong version or something.
Yeah, and that actually I will have to, I think, get back to the task force on this. That may be the markup effect.
And can I just say that right now, like, this is an example.
Sure,
This is
sure.
nothing that we are like,
I was just noting that the reductions,
right.
anyway, just trying to verify when I had the right information.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, no, the report is authoritative, so take that as as the truth.
We should have set this up differently in terms of being able to figure out the hand signals online.
Right.
Thank
Hard
you.
to-
I'm curious about the substitution effect, because we've seen a lot of other studies talking about people simply substituting other products, in terms of alcohol, or also cannabis or something.
Yep.
Have you studied that issue, or can you speak a little bit more on that?
Yes and yes. I wouldn't say I have not taken a deep dive on that for a while, but there's sort of two types of substitution effects we can think about. Now, we would expect to see both. One is sort of within product, where you move from, and this will use words that are more typically used in for spirits, but sort of premium top shelf, moving down into mid-tier and less expensive versions of the same sort of spirit or beer or wine. You can think microbrew versus mega brew. You can think Pappy Van Winkle bourbon versus something that's much less expensive. And so that's one type of substitution that we would expect to see. The other that you're mentioning is substitution towards other products, legal or otherwise, cannabis on the legal side, other drugs that are illegal, because people are attempting to alter their brains with substances. And when one option becomes more expensive, the natural tendency is to some extent substitute towards other substances. And the literature does support this in the specific context of an alcohol price increase. I think at the time we didn't find anything particularly quantitative, although there was some suggestive evidence that supported what is a pretty common behavioral response to changing prices.
A few more slides to go.
Sure. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so yeah, next slide. And so this is just illustrating one dimension of the likely difference in changes in behavior. And this is number of drinks. It's not a percentage change. So apologies for that. But we did see relatively higher prevalence of risky drinking behaviors amongst white populations, higher consumption, but you can see here a lower modeled reduction in consumption overall than some other populations. And there are a lot of factors behind this specific slide, but the point being that we would expect to see a variety of different effects that will vary by circumstances, whether it's geography, race and ethnicity, or other characteristics. And then next slide. Okay, so just a couple slides here on sort of summarizing. First, most of the harm imposed by excessive alcohol consumption are related to issues that are largely unaffected by prices. You increase the tax on beer and wine, you're not improving access to healthcare for any population unless you're funding a specific program, for example. We would expect some reduction in consumption and therefore some reduction in the burden caused by excessive alcohol use, just a couple percent of the total burden we estimated in 2019, which is similar in magnitude to the reduction in consumption that we would expect, but that leaves a lot of harm out there to potentially mitigate. And I'd say one important conclusion here is that tax policy can move behavior. As we've modeled it, it's not going to be a big driver of change in behavior. And so it's a useful tool for thinking about a comprehensive harm reduction framework, but certainly is not a replacement for other particularly evidence-based interventions. I'll move to the final slide. So big picture findings, I think, we found $5 billion of harm caused, economic burden caused by excessive alcohol consumption. Increasing tax rates serves sort of public policy interests in that it can help to better align the cost to consumers of purchasing alcohol with the burden imposed by those consumers. It's not perfect, but can certainly help to the extent that The revenue raised is used to fund other programs and services that are designed to mitigate the harm. That increases the strength of the nexus between the tax and the harms caused by alcohol. Again, another good public policy goal. Tax structure matters. I've said this too many times, but we modeled a very specific tax increase scenario. There are other ways to affect access, to change prices based on other factors such as location, ethanol content, minimum pricing schemes, these kinds of things. And those might have a bigger impact on risky behavior, although the literature is probably not as conclusive on that point as on the price and consumption relationship. And then finally, as we've mentioned several times throughout the presentation, both consumption and the harms caused by consumption of alcohol vary considerably across populations, across geography, et cetera. And keeping those differences in front of mind in developing new policy is pretty critical to, at a minimum, not exacerbate existing disparities. So that's our last slide, or my last slide. And again, I will get back to the committee on the specifics of the scenario. But again, do take the written report as what we did. And happy to take any other questions at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Dyke. We really do. I think in the future, I would love to have you in the room because you missed a lot. Okay.
Happy to be there. I'm happy to be invited.
So if you'll hang on, you do have a couple of questions. Yeah, please.
So you modeled the harms of alcohol economically to the state and behavioral impacts potentially of a tax increase. But alcohol as an industry is about a $17 billion commerce in the state of Oregon. And, you know, you're talking about a 5% reduction, which would be, I don't know, $850 million in lost business if that were to happen, a 5% reduction in consumption. Was any thought or taken to what the economic damage would be to the state by imposing a tax?
We did not address that, and that was not part of the initial study charge. So the answer there is no. And would not dispute the fact that if you're reducing consumption, you're obviously reducing sales, and there's an impact there, but we did not model that.
That's just where did you get, how did that come about?
The big
calculation.
How did the calculation come?
Yeah, he said a 5% reduction in consumption, and the dollar figures, what the guilds have communicated is the total combined commerce of beer, wine, and spirit sales in the state of Oregon.
Yeah.
That's
What?
17 billion. Yeah. So, and again, like I have, you know, I can talk about this. There's a bunch of downstream impacts, the price increase in alcohol. Alcohol subsidizes food sales in restaurants and grocery stores, for instance, that the margins in the grocery store are 30% on alcohol and 1 to 2% on food. So if your alcohol sales slow, they're going to have to make up those revenues elsewhere by increasing prices or reducing sales or other issues to make up lost revenue or go out of business. For my business, if I saw a 5% reduction, I employ about 120 people, I might have to consider letting 6 of them go. And so that, you know, all of these impacts, you know, have costs as well. And, you know, even the state tax revenues from $850 million worth of commerce is about a third of the total net gain that was 240 million-ish in the increased tax revenues. So you'd be getting, you know, a liquor tax or more alcohol taxes over here, but potentially reducing, you know, revenue taxes on the other side. So I'm just curious about those considerations because it's quite complicated and it's a big picture.
So only comment I'll add there is, I mean, I agree it's complicated. It's something that can and should be modeled probably for, you know, with a concrete proposal, but also do want to note that I would characterize our estimates as based on the literature upper bounds due to the substitution effect and other things. And that doesn't mean that, you know, a reduction to a beer and wine industry has impacts on the beer and wine. In terms of the broader industry, the effect is maybe smaller, but again, not to say that it shouldn't be modeled or that it couldn't be modeled.
But I was gonna have a similar question, just whether that had been factored in, so.
Okay.
Someone online?
Senator Solomon
Senator
has a
Solomon.
question.
Senator
Thank you so much. I apologize for my voice. I actually had 5 different little questions, but I'll They're very quick, but one of them was already answered. So I was kind of curious, have you been able to delve down a little bit and come in some of the stats that you had presented? One being why American Native Indian stats, their death rate, why, and what was the factors behind that? And the other one was Harney County specifically. I know that Chair Sanchez brought that forward and asked about how could we possibly break that down further. I'll just shoot you the other two right now. And then the other one was on private business. I mean, how tough is that to collect stats? Because I could imagine there are people who say, I'm going to let you go. I don't want to have this on your record. Go get help and go find another job. But there's no real connection to how that's alcohol related. And then the final one was, as part of your study, did you potentially look at policy versus the pennies? Is there policies that can be changed, that can be addressed? And it's something that I've brought up before. We talked about a lot of the policy that we've passed in Oregon. Is there policy that can be changed versus looking at taxing as the answer to this? I was just curious. Thanks. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, no, all good questions, and I'll try to address them all. And short memory, so most recent one first in terms of the policies. Short answer is no. I mean, we did a little bit of ancillary looking just as we're doing the literature review. Studies look at multiple things, but the focus of our study was on a very well-defined policy scenario. That's what you're describing is, again, something else that can be done. It's a relatively big study, and we had to do what we needed to do to answer certain specific questions. Craig Prinz is familiar with we've done similar kinds of studies for evidence-based sort of criminal justice programs, and I think I would encourage the task force to certainly think about some form of, as you're working to propose policy responses to the questions, look to the evidence, what works, what doesn't work, and think about things from that perspective, because not all solutions are created equal. So that's pretty critical. With respect to the business question, yes, I mean, all of these things are difficult. I'd say it's, probably within the health realm, it's probably easiest to say, liver cirrhosis, these kinds of things. There's some, no lines are completely black and white, but reasonably clean lines. As you move further away from things we can directly measure, yes, it gets more complicated. There's survey data, there's other kinds of information one can use to get at these questions. It's not perfect. Happy to offline if you're interested in specific literature. We cite them all in the study. So not perfect, but again, I think we didn't, I can't articulate off the top of my head categories we explicitly left off, but we didn't include anything for which we didn't feel there was a reasonable sort of empirical basis for including. And again, different research will have different numbers. We tried to find a reasonable range. Two other good questions with respect to the Native American death rates. That's, I think, I don't know if Dr. Seidlinger wants to talk to that, but that's closer to sort of OHA's sort of bailiwick. I don't know the answer. We didn't have the capacity to look in more deeply. That was certainly something that stood out. And I mean, I could imagine a lot of different stories related to some of the factors we talked about. There may be data issues. I don't know, but I think it's hard to dispute that there's a disparity there in some form. And I'd say the same thing for Harney County. We had hoped to be able to do a little bit more geographically, didn't expect to be able to do a full deep dive at any particular place, but there's, within the context of the study, didn't have a chance to get very deep.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, who's online there?
Solera Salazar.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. It was very informative. So on part of it, I believe you said about 50% of all of the alcoholic beverages purchased were borne by the heaviest drinkers, which is like 10%, which is also roughly the percentage of people with alcohol use disorder. So does that mean all of the revenue coming in from sales of those products, 50% of it is people with an alcohol use disorder that need treatment?
Well, so I'd say, again, this is maybe a better question for OHA, but based on what we looked at, the answer is not necessarily, because that it's consumption by drinks, and so it's not revenue weighted. So you might have people that potentially drink. Again, the math could work out either way, but if you're drinking more expensive beverages less often, that makes up some of the difference in terms of number of alcoholic beverages. That this is an empirical question. One could look to or should look to the data to answer, and I don't have a perfect answer there. But so it's not immediately obvious what the distribution of revenue and sales would be just based on those numbers. We can say that the top decile of drinkers consume a very disproportionately large share of the total alcohol. And we'll make a point that we looked at excessive alcohol consumption. Not everyone. That by itself does not define alcohol use disorder. Whether it's and it's more than the top 10%. You get binge drinking lower down the spectrum.
Okay, please.
I'm
sorry.
That's okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I
Go
missed
ahead,
you.
Dr. Tom. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, this is Tom Gina, OHA. I had a question, but first I was going to kind of respond to the comments about the AIN American Indian Last Name death rate. That's something we see with lots of things in health, but in terms of alcohol specifically, many of these different groups, including that group, drink overall less than whites, but the harms are higher, and that has to do with a huge array of factors, everything from income to access to healthcare, access to healthy foods, more stressors in lives, structural racism. It's a huge, complicated picture. So it's a well-known kind of effect that we see. I also had a question about what's figure 12 in the reports, Dr. Dyke. That's the one that shows the reduction in the tax scenario, the change in total alcohol consumption by decile of drinking. And so you had it displayed as percentages, and I just wanted to point out that that is proportional. It's percentage representation of the change, which is a very helpful way to look at it. But I think if you look at it in terms of the number of drinks reduction in each of these categories, it would be quite a different chart, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
If the heavy drinkers are drinking so much, and the reduction in drinks for them might actually be a greater number than the reduction in drinks at the bottom 30%. So I when we're looking at that chart. Yeah, so that was just my main comments on that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And important, for a lot of purposes to keep both in mind, both the relative change, which is associated with the harm, directly associated with harms, with the number of drinks change, which is, more closely related to the questions of revenue and sales and so on.
And it's Craig, again, the number that I wanted you to help me understand jumped off the page is the fetal alcohol syndrome number, because it looks like such a large part of the social cost or the monetized cost. And can you just tell me, I assume that's because you're having to model that loss over the life of that child once born, is that right?
Yes, and the sort of intensity of the services. Which is, yes, so that's exactly right.
Yeah, I'm glad, because I didn't know. So thank you for modeling that out. And so that was factoring into both the public and private costs. Is that right?
That would be in the public costs. And the distinction's not perfect, but it's sort of generally costs imposed on others.
Okay.
So,
So we don't have an idea what that looks like in terms of sort of private insurance or anybody not.
Well, yeah. So this is sort of an unfortunate coincidence of terminology. Not all of the public costs, and this may not be where that was headed, but are public sector costs.
Right.
They're costs borne by, imposed, generally speaking, on everybody. Much of which, a large share of which, would be imposed on the public sector. Special education. A lot of those healthcare costs would be publicly funded for sure. Off the top of my head, I don't. Well, I don't. I'm pretty sure we did not have a clean way. I'm pretty sure we did not have a clean way to look at sort of publicly funded healthcare versus private.
And I'm sorry, I'm gonna take a little bit of chair privilege. That $520.2 million in terms of crime victimization, is that specific to, or do you have any idea whether that is our criminal justice system in terms of judicial? Does it include the DOC and longer term impacts?
It's not that it's cost imposed on the victim. So in that case, it's not I believe this is something else I'll confirm, but it's not the judge costs, the court costs, it's victimization costs. And some of it is hard to quantify, so-called intangible costs, pain and suffering, these kinds of things.
Right. So really mostly specifically victimization, not necessarily the overall cost to the state in terms of just what we would endure, again, judicial, the overall criminal justice system. And if we're dealing with somebody longer term processes around the DOC or anything like that.
Correct.
Yes, sir.
Sorry, Aaron Sarnoff. Your report indicates that taxes are not very targeted to, because the harms are so centralized in the smaller group of heavier consumers, and that taxes target the entire audience. Was there any consideration or any research as to what better methods to target to the selected group that is imposing the greater burden of costs?
Well, again, that's not an area we looked at comprehensively. I think I mentioned this in the slide. One strategy that has been used, or I think Oregon's considered it, and I don't recall if it's passed, but minimum unit pricing as another way, because particularly for the heavier drinkers, one of the things you see first is that sort of within product substitution towards cheaper spirits, for example. And if you have minimum unit pricing, to some extent, you take away the ability to consume alcohol by shifting towards less expensive products. But again, we did not do a comprehensive analysis of such options. They are out there, potentially.
Okay. I'm hoping that we can let the doctor. We do have to move on. We're a little bit behind right now. So, yes, thank you. Thank you very much, actually. It's very, very helpful. Bits of information. I encourage people to look deeper into the report as well, because as I intend to do myself, it's really hugely important. Where are we at now? Okay.
Senator Myers is going to present just kind of
That's financial analysis. There we go. There you are. Yes. I assume that might be you. My apologies. I didn't do introductions for folks in the room who weren't necessarily on the task force. But here we go.
Totally fine. Thank you. So Samantha Myers, Adult Behavioral Health Director with the Oregon Health Authority, sitting on the side of services and treatment. Here, obviously, on the public health side. So today is really an opportunity to bring out some numbers. It's like a teaser almost to a final report that will come out around how much we're spending around substance use disorder. And I can say that I think Rep. Sanchez or Chair Sanchez, I feel like it's been a good 2 or 3 years since you advocated for like, let's just, how can we, look and see how much we're spending, not just like what OHA is doing, but like everybody puts, money into substance use disorder. So this is really just very, very high level numbers. And it's really designed with the hope that you'll have questions and be like, how did we get there? And be able to dig a little bit deeper. I think I don't know, we're coming back in April. Is that right? I can't remember if we had decided that, but once the final report is out, we'll be back and we'll actually bring the researchers with us so you can ask about the methodology and dig in a little bit deeper. But this was something that we wanted to share and had committed to. And really, like I said, it's really just to inspire some conversation. The numbers are look large when you see them all together. But I think it's depending on where you're sitting, it leaves a lot of questions to ask, I think. So, next slide. Thank you. Yep, I think we got that. Thank you. So, one thing that I wanted to start with is that when we finally got an entity to be able to do this research and work for us, we were looking at the cost, how much it costs to do the entire continuum of care, right? So just appreciating the focus of this task force is very specific. Wanted you to know that we were really looking at, like, if we're taking care of the entire continuum, what is the overall, like, how much are we spending is really the first question that we asked. And this is looking at the biennium of 2021, 2023, so those 2 years. And then a little bit of gaps, or, you know, I think maybe opportunities to consider, like, how we're spending. I think on the, you know, on the behavioral health side for us, it was an opportunity to say, how much money are we spending? Are we getting the outcomes we want? And then how do we really partner with our other agencies to maximize and leverage that money and see if we can push it towards outcomes in a systematic way. So this is a really high-level overview. If you watch legislative sessions ever, you may have seen this multi-color. It's the one we have this year. And you can see that we have everything from primary prevention. We've added our crisis response system now into the substance use disorder continuum. It didn't used to be there, but it absolutely belongs there. Screening, when we screen people to see their needs, entry into treatment, and then recovery support. So, and across the top, you'll see that throughout that entire continuum, peer services are a part of it. Harm reduction methodologies are a part of it as a strategy. So beyond naloxone and safer using supplies, but just conceptually, how do you have somebody reduce their risk? And then beginning from crisis response all the way to recovery support using medication-assisted treatment, so methadone, buprenorphine to support recovery. So the most important thing about the slide, which I think many people know and have heard, is that it's not linear, right? So we work with people and see people in every single line item, and they can come in and out, right? So we may meet somebody when they've had a period of recovery and then relapsed and are now in a place where they need rescreening on a full episode of treatment. We may begin working with people in treatment that seem like they were about to do well and aren't, and now they need a little bit more. We may meet people during crisis response. And so there's a fluidity in terms of how folks are served on the continuum. We serve them at any door. And that was just really the intent of the slide. So when you see the numbers, we were just coming from, like, how much are we spending for this whole continuum and what does it look like? I'll just pause there. It's not rocket science, but wanted to lay the groundwork for you. Next slide. Okay, so the first slide that you're seeing is the financial inventory, right? And it's, you know, the collection of trying to understand substance use disorder spending across several agencies in Oregon. And that gives you the list of our state agencies. And at the bottom is the grand total at a very, very high level, not really drilled down for the 2021-2023 biennium.
So I just want to identify, you have the Department of Corrections there at $7 million that the Department of Corrections itself is spending on.
That's right. So each line is what each agency is spending, right? And then collectively. Okay. The other thing that I did not mention at the beginning, but want to also note is that the numbers that we're seeing, it's how much it costs. We don't have currently, like, how much Medicaid would offset, right? So a lot of our system goes through Medicaid, and so we don't have that offset. And that's like another arm of the study that we've been interested in seeing, but haven't gotten there yet.
Does this include federal matching funds, same as grant blocks, things like that?
Oh, you'll see. Oh, okay, that's coming up.
Oh,
yeah,
fantastic.
so great questions. Yeah.
Thank you.
So we're starting really high and then break down as much as we can right now. Next slide. So now you're seeing the financial inventory across strategies and programmatic areas to the best of our ability, where we try to break it down in sort of buckets that are consistent across all the agencies and that are most common.
Can I ask, is this just spending or is it also appropriations? Because there's been more than over $1 billion in appropriations since 2021 for behavioral health, but this is less than $1 billion in terms of spending.
And this is just for those agencies that I showed, so it doesn't have private, it doesn't, it's just really what the agencies have
Spending.
spent. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And well, you, next slide, I think coming up. Oh, sorry, this is by county, so you can see the sum of spending that was put in county by county. Same thing, it's same dollar amount, just showing the funds there.
So can you clarify the out-of-state, statewide, tribal and undetermined? Is this one?
I'm sorry, the out-of-state.
Well, just that you have a financial inventory, it's the sum of SUD, but there is the out-of-state. What exactly does that look, what does that mean? What is the statewide? How are we identifying that piece? Specifically, the tribal piece, does that mean resources going directly to the tribes? And then what's the undetermined?
So the undetermined is where, that's really interesting because it's a sum of money that they're still trying to drill down to actually figure out like where it is. It was, there are pockets of money that we've had trouble really identifying where it went, who it came from. Small amount compared to some of the larger amount, but also, interestingly enough, one of the biggest challenges around the project was less around, in some ways, gathering like big numbers. It was around how people define the trigger prevention. And Rosie and I, we've been on calls thinking about, right, what is primary prevention and, even just like when the OLCC makes sure that people are not, allowing underage drinking, does that fall into the primary prevention category, right? So some of that is just funding that we're trying to sort out there. Next slide.
And then,
Oh, sorry.
so statewide here is not some of the all county statewide is spending for the whole.
Yes.
state.
Yeah.
So I just wanted you to clarify
Yes.
those things. So
Yes,
that
sorry,
An
yeah.
idea of what those things.
Not in addition, right.
Right.
Yes.
Not in addition.
Not in
What we're
addition.
doing statewide.
Yeah.
And then state.
Out of state spending is, so that part, I did not ask about, but we do, my guess is that some out of state spending is if we found resources actually out of state for people, which we do sometimes in Washington, California, Idaho, Vancouver. Yeah. In the providing areas. Yeah, and that's Grand Point. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
That was,
This is a question from Solera Salazar.
Oh, I just had a clarification. I believe at least the out of state. I run a recovery housing organization along with a treatment center. And because there are no Oregon resources for stabilization, detox, and what have you, we have to transport all of our clients over to Vancouver to get resources because Washington has far better resources than we have here in Oregon.
We also, I would agree. And also when we think about our remote areas in Eastern Oregon, sometimes Idaho is a place, it's the 30-minute drive to Boise is where some people are getting services too. So we do have some pocket areas like that for sure. This slide starts to break down the actual funding sources. So when you were asking about, is there like double match? Is there block grant dollars? This begins to look at some of the literal financial inventory in terms of how the spending breaks down between general funds, federal match. And again, and block grants, which we get every 2 years, the state opioid response grants, which we've gotten every couple of years. And their funding can vary a little bit, but it's not a dramatic swing. And this gives you a good idea. There's the Measure 110 funding, our marijuana funds, lottery funds. So that just gives you some breakdown on where the dollars are coming from. And again, we have not done, and what we've been thinking about, if there's interest, is really understanding what the Medicaid offset is. So if this is all the spending, is it like, it's not all general funds, right? Like, and it's a combination of things, and we know that our providers are billing Medicaid for some of the services. So that's part 2 of our project.
For your next presentation, will we get a comparison of appropriations versus spending? Because to Nell's point.
Yeah, you'll have
pretty big numbers on the input side in the last.
Yeah, you'll have more detail and even some pretty specific detail at the county level as well. So, yeah.
What about like the city level?
I'm sorry,
You said county, what about city?
you know, we have only been doing, I will double check, but it's been state and county.
Yeah, like cities don't usually get that type of resource because they're, I mean.
We fund directly through the counties, I guess, not all. What I should say is, at least for Oregon Health Authority, we use our community mental health programs and our community-based organizations where they receive the funding to implement a lot of the statutory requirements to serve people. They're part of our safety net. So I have not seen city spending. Commissioner Sanchez, not to put you on the spot. I can't think of that off the top of my head in any substantive way.
Right, apparently we're.
So I was just looking at some website about this, and it said that 10% goes to cities and 10% goes to counties. So is that not accurate info?
That's the part that I had not looked at.
Yeah, right. And because cities don't provide necessarily said services, that's why I say it probably is, it's there, but it's probably someplace else.
CCO, yeah, are in there too. But I would have to double check on
Can
this.
we ask, Rob, are you here? Rob Corbett, are you online?
Yes, I'm online.
Sir, by chance, do you have an idea of how that happens within your city?
So I'm not sure, I'm not completely sure of the question, but I can tell you that cities receive liquor tax, and cities also receive a portion of the state marijuana tax.
Okay, and that's usually expended on what from the city perspective? If you can, I don't know if you know that answer, but.
Yeah, we have a legal system, we have a municipal court, we also have law enforcement and ambulance services.
Right, and that's what I assumed, that it was specifically towards just moving in that sort of criminal justice area rather than obviously health aspects of things. You would not necessarily put it towards substance use disorder type expenditures, correct?
Here in Umatilla County, medical services would be provided by the hospital or the county health department.
Yes, that was my assumption about how that would work. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Dean Smiglinger. I think, I don't know the website that the person was looking for with percentages going to cities and counties, but there is a specific funding formula under the opioid settlement that distributes money to cities in addition to counties and the state and our tribal.
And right, and you know, let me just say my first foray, I guess, into alcohol taxes, looking at how that it's a very complex distribution model. Yeah. It's amazing to me. And it's like this percentage of this percentage of this percentage. It's very bizarre. But knowing that usually is how it works, is that anything going specifically to cities is not necessarily spent on substance use disorder at all. It's really through counties. And so we're talking about not really apples and oranges, but maybe Granny Smiths and Fuji. There we go.
Yeah, but those funds could appear on at least the side of the ledger of like funding that's available, and how that is then spent is a determination that's made by, policy makers. So for instance, with the current taxes, percent of that is these services.
Right.
So that's something that could be.
You could look at it that way. And let me tell you, if I were to suggest in any way, shape, or form that we change that model, I would not You're the end
Oh,
of it.
well, I'm saying on the side of the ledger of funding that is potentially available. That we know
No, I wouldn't call it available, no. I would not call it available. I'd be perfectly frank with you. The distribution model that exists right now, we dealt with just an absolute uproar when Measure 110 went into play. And the marijuana money had to be redistributed in some way. We had to backfill a lot of things because some of that money came out of cities and counties. That was very, very hard to do. And it's not, there is no, I have no plan of redistributing the distribution model that's happening right this very minute. Absolutely no plan whatsoever to do that. That would destabilize cities and counties. It's not something that I think is appropriate to do. Cities really do spend a lot of their resources, obviously, again, on that sort of criminal justice aspect of things. And they feel significantly underfunded in that realm as it is. So I'll just say that out loud so the city can hear me.
I hear you on that. I think the point, though, is that some of this money is coming from alcohol taxes, but it's not being used for substance use disorder, specifically for treatment, which is, I think what Jana was saying. And that's been an issue for us for a long time, that should we be funding general fund purposes for a city? It's just a policy question. Should we be funding the general fund services?
Right, and that question is older than us, right? It really, really is. Well, maybe not older, but. But I will also say that we have certainly had questions from, you know, just police and that criminal justice aspect of things of how do we put some resources in that direction as well, because they are distinctly related to the issues that we're talking about with regard to substance use disorder, the criminal aspects of things. Those are huge pieces. If there are, you know, we would have less drunk drivers if we had more cops on the road to be able to deal with those issues. Like, that's the argument that I've heard back and forth. And so, yes, if the question is not entirely, we need more resources for any type of substance use disorder. Just that. It is that we need more resources for the entire system to deal with that issue. So,
Chair,
thank you. Yes,
Solera and Fawn have questions.
okay. Fawn, I haven't heard from you yet, but so Solera, hang on for just a second.
Well, I was just curious if we have any information about how other states fund their SUD treatment, that sort of thing, because there was a great article at some point from a psychiatrist who had talked about the fact that Oregon's system is very disjointed in terms of there's no kind of state oversight over the whole system or over the spending around behavioral health and substance use disorder. And so a lot of times, you know, that's why I think we have such a hard time figuring out how much or where this money's going and how much is being spent on treatment. So I'm just curious, are we unique in our funding formula? Are we not? I just don't have a sense of that. And someone had mentioned Washington State having a lot better access, and I'm curious if we know why that is. I mean, I always like to look at what states are doing it well and why are they doing it well. And obviously in Oregon, it doesn't seem like it's just an issue of money. It's about how we're spending that money.
You know, hang on one
I
second.
I don't have an answer about whether or not we're studying other states and what other states are doing that is better. And I'm happy to take that back and then email Rosie for everybody to know one way or the other. I will say, you know, the one thing that, you know, I want to say in that summary about Oregon is, I mean, in part, we're different than other states because we still have the initiative referendum model, right, for our voters. So that impacts the work that we do. And I think Measure 110 is an example of that. But I also want to just caution that somehow there is a state that's doing really well right now with the fentanyl crisis going across the nation. And SAMHSA did, you know, even provide and come out with saying their ranking of states, you know, it was always like Oregon. So like, that's an actual inaccurate number. And we we looked to see what states were doing better based on SAMHSA's ranking, like who's 1, 2, and 3, like who's got great access, and number 1 is South Dakota, right? So it's not like, I mean, and South Dakota may have a phenomenal system, you know, it's not that, it's just that it doesn't quite align with the Oregon population. And I think how we utilize our voters' input, how we utilize our provider input. And that's all to say that we wouldn't disagree that there has been silos of work that need to come together to really maximize and leverage the funding. I think that was the heart of the study, but I'm always a little cautious about states doing that much better than Oregon, just because of the right now with overdoses and fentanyl. Too.
Right, and South Dakota has about maybe 15% of the people that we have. That is one thing to be really seriously, you know, cognizant of. I will also say that, you know, looking at other states is hugely important just in terms of how their structure is.
Yes.
And we have always, I have to say, as I have been digging into this issue over and over again, recognized that we do not have a coordinated system.
No.
And we've designed, you know, well, people, there's many times, the layers of structure that we have for dealing with both addictions and mental health and child welfare are over and over and over again, legislation on top of legislation on top of legislation. And like basically trying to straighten out that bowl of spaghetti is going to be a really interesting process. So, you know, if people are willing to do it, I'd be happy to dig in and try, but that is the thing is our design is very, very difficult to untangle. Mental health folks have been asking for that for years to say, can we figure out how do we untangle the way we spend money or all of the different things that we've put towards spending money on this so that we don't have to bill for this, bill for that, bill for this, bill for that, right? It's very, very difficult. So yes, we're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. Do we want to dig in, try to figure out how do we do this differently? Yes, I would imagine that we do. That's not going to be the easiest thing. And
yeah, and I would even, you know, I would add to, we don't have, you know, what became clear for me, at least with this study, is we don't have clear shared definitions of treatment. We don't have shared outcomes definitions, and we don't have similar collection tools and technology. So all of that just reinforces the siloed work that you know, have mentioned that we have. So, but yeah.
We're not alone.
No, we're not alone, not at all. Yeah. But South Dakota's better.
It was Massachusetts, the one that was called better, but
okay, folks, I'm sorry. We actually should let Ms. Byers go through the rest of the slides. And Solara, I will get to you, I promise.
I think the next slide, I believe, is we're coming up on workforce. So one of the things with this study was looking at the cost it would take to build out the workforce necessary for this full continuum of substance use disorder services. It took into account not just the, like, how much does it cost to have a full-time FTE in every full-time FTE position that's needed, but the cost of what it takes for somebody to have their education, their certification, their supervision. So I just mentioned that because, and it also, this number is not that like the legislature is going to pay or one entity is going to pay, but I mentioned that because the number is pretty impressive when we start going through the slide, and also to say, I believe we just released the preliminary report yesterday. So if you haven't seen it, Rosie, I'll make sure you have what was released yesterday so you can pass it out. The initial area that we were working with was with workforce, because in some ways you can spend and spend and spend, and if there's nobody in the withdrawal management, then you cannot really. So we started with workforce. So next slide. So this is how costs were determined. And like I mentioned, it was what kind of formal education would be needed, any kind of certification or registration, specific training related to their area on the continuum, the number of, client hours that you need in order to get your certification, supervision, and any background checks or completion that's needed. So what you're seeing is a breakdown by positions that are predominant in the substance use disorder continuum. The education that would be needed, so you're basically, undergrad or any other education, and then the training, supervision, and certification, and the total cost by a specific position, and then the total cost overall. Next slide. I thought it was a huge number. You all reacted very calmly. Although if you wanted to hire some, sorry.
There's so many workforce needs in so many sectors, and this assumes there's people, right? Who even want to go.
That's right.
To take these jobs. Like, have we done anything of that? I mean, if we have the money, will the people come? If we have all this money, it's like what we're doing.
Well, actually, let her go through the next slide, and we'll tell you whether or not the people will come. You go look at the pay scale for those folks, and, because I have a certificate in alcohol and drug studies from the University of California at Berkeley. I could not afford to be an alcohol and drug counselor.
Yes, exactly.
Keep going. And I appreciate it. I want to definitely get through this so you have time at the end. But I will say, the other thing that we've been looking at, there may be the people, but where it's needed. So if you are a CADC, a counselor, we're trying to figure out what the actual wage would be that would keep somebody. And you're needing to work in Bend. The cost of the housing event, like we have providers that are buying houses so that it's almost like dorm space for their workforce, and like Baker, I mean, all kinds of, I think that's the other factor, and that speaks to what you're asking as well. Yeah. Sorry. So these are wages that we've been looking at, and what I will say is this study is not the only study that's been looking at, what the hourly wages would be. Our community-based organization, association, Heather Jeffress, they did a study, and the numbers have been coming out about the same. Like, this is about where you want to start seeing some hourly wages in order to think about filling the workforce gap. Next slide.
And this is where we want to see them.
Well, next slide.
Yeah.
Here we go. Yeah, this is, this is where we're determining the cost that's actually needed in order to, the number of positions, the total wages, including benefits and annual salary. Yeah, it's interesting. Really some of our positions are really at minimum wage. And, I think one of the challenges that we face structurally too is that some of our acute care needs, so if you think about withdrawal management or residential services, those 24-hour shifts tend to be folks that are like starting to get back on their feet, want to give back, have solid recovery, or new into the profession, and they are making like $17 an hour. They're at minimum wage, and they have some of the hardest work. So, it's a combination of how do you get the skilled professionals that you need, right? And that can be everything from doctors who prescribe all the way down to, and then how do you really sort of reorganize and elevate those acute levels of care that have the overnight shifts. So it's a puzzle that we are definitely trying to find out.
Are these wages comparable to other places? I mean, I saw a ranker just in cost of care, and Oregon ranked as one of the top most expensive states to get SUD treatment. And I'm seeing these wages, and I'm trying to understand if we're just seeing lower wages in other places that makes the cost lower, or what is driving up the cost of services in Oregon compared to places, because these wages aren't exactly blowing the top off the lid there.
Yeah, no, they're not. And I think there is a couple factors, at least in the last, I try not to go, well, there was the pandemic and COVID, right? I mean, but I will say that the acuity of the folks that we're seeing was really compounded by the isolation of COVID and the need to separate, right? So that meant we cut our treatment ability in half. And people were out there still struggling. So we're finding a lot of individuals have complex needs. So we're not really just, it's not like, okay, here's somebody who has a substance use disorder treatment. We'll have them go to withdrawal management, get them to residential, find them housing. That's what they focus on. We're seeing a lot of folks, I mean, even out of the state hospital, where 70% of those individuals have a substance use disorder as well. So complex needs, I think, is really the
Sure.
challenge.
Wouldn't that also be true everywhere else as well, though?
It could be. I mean, I guess it depends on the population, right? In each state and how many folks. So, yeah. And I think, this is part of the conversation that we started just a little bit ago, right? Which is, are we coordinated enough in order to know that we have maximized the funding, and that was, the hope of the study. Yeah, to be able to say that.
Well, and reality, as unfortunately, as a state, we have done sadly some disinvestment. We disinvested very distinctly in our mental health systems and in prediction systems. Like we did not have the infrastructure there, not just the coordination, but overall infrastructure, which is why we did the strategic plan analysis in the first place, because we knew we did not have the infrastructure. Yeah. So cost could be related very much to the fact that we just don't have it. Right. Yes.
I wanted to ask just about the sideload funds, because that's something that's come up for years about why are the tobacco addiction funds in that fund and the alcohol in this fund and the drugs in this fund, and people are coming in with coexisting things and mental health. And would it help you at OHA, or if the funds weren't so siloed, or is that way too complex to untangle? It's weird if people are coming in with multiple things going on, that we have these funds for one thing.
The simple answer is yes and yes. I think the fact is most of our funding on the prevention side, even on the behavioral health side, comes down categorically. And we have to deal with that. We'd be better if we had funds that we could use more holistically that was targeting individuals who come in rather than problems. Yes, but that is not those aren't state decisions that we made necessarily. Though we go categorical, and there's a lot of this funding is federal funding and does come down categorically, and that often does reinforce silos or the fact that you have different resources that are going to help someone with a tobacco who uses tobacco. But the research shows, and what we try to do is pair folks together, pair resources together, because if you deal with their opioid addiction and their nicotine addiction at the same time, you're going to have more success on both. If you deal with one and leave the other, you have more relapses than people that actually using. I don't have as much data buried in my mind around alcohol and coexisting use with opioids and nicotine things, but our funding for the most part comes down categorically, and then we have to try to make it work.
Yeah, federal funding in particular, I think does.
Okay, are we ready for
I think
questions? Or do we
we're almost at the end here.
Okay,
Yeah. Is there one more slide? And if there is, it's just kind of a different way to look at it. So determining workforce costs. I mean, I think another version, just looking at those numbers. And next slide, is that the last? Yep.
Okay.
I was just trying to.
Okay, so Laura, and then is that
Annalise.
Annalise? There we go. Laura, go ahead. And then
Yeah, thank you. I do want to share, as somebody that runs a treatment center, and I have, colleagues all over the Portland metro area, we have had to increase our wages by 26% in the last 12 months. And across the industry, we used to have interns that would work for free, and now all internships are paid at a lower amount. And our administrative burden costs have increased. I think we're at almost 46%. So I do know that MACBO is going to do another one of these. We were just on a meeting the other day. They said, oh, let's get out this study again, because everybody's sharing that the wages have just skyrocketed. So I would just caution everybody, these are absolutely accurate and wonderful. And I think if we're looking at the current state of staffing and the need and expenses, it's going to be far higher.
Well, right, because if you can work for Amazon for more than you can work as an alcohol and drug counselor, that's a problem. Annalise.
So I have a comment and a suggestion. The comment on the workforce piece that I just want to point out, and I'm not sure, Sam, why this decision was made to focus on just kind of that narrow band of staff, but it doesn't include nurses or physicians or addiction psychologists. So in that respect, I don't know if we're going to hear about kind of the residential plus study, but it doesn't really match up with that. So I want to make sure everybody understands that. And so one suggestion I have, I can't remember if this was in the work plan, but to Solara's point, I think hearing from folks in the provider industry about, the cost of doing business in Oregon, because I think they do face some of the same barriers that the alcohol industry does, although probably I'm guessing a much greater lift on citing facilities. And then my other suggestion / ask, Sam, of OHA, as this is getting finalized in terms of this task force's work, is can we get very specific? I mean, there's not very much revenue that is actually tied to substance use disorder services, right? Like it's really just the alcohol and drug services account and the cannabis taxes. So particularly for the alcohol and drug services account, it sounds like it's not completely clear how down in the weeds we're going to get there. I think it would be for this task force to have much more detail there, as opposed to federal Medicaid match and leveraging that in CCBHCs or FQHCs versus, CCO funding or something. Like, I think really diving in on the state revenue would be helpful. That's my suggestion. Folks, feel free to disagree.
No, I agree. And I think we understood that. And this was just, a desire to see initial numbers, and the final report, there'll be the ability to look more specifically and consider whether or not there's further analysis to do to get even more specific than the report that will come out in April. So I think there's a lot of different things to look at that will be informative to different groups. And obviously we knew that this particular task force would want to focus on alcohol. And we're working with our health policy analytics team also to get that kind of information. But even in the final report, it's got lots of information that will drill down, and I suspect we'll still have some pathways that need more detail for different groups.
Thank you, Rob.
Yeah, a comment and a question. My comment is going back to the costs of the workforce. The benefits were higher than the salaries, and that number doesn't seem right. So, but my question is, I appreciate the need to look at the cost of workforce and how that plays into what we're trying to accomplish. Did the state of Oregon or OHA, when we grabbed the marijuana tax to be able to provide treatment services, did we direct some of that money toward workforce development?
I think we did, but it wasn't that the actual measure 110, like we didn't say, here's a chunk of it to go towards workforce development. I believe within the different folks that received some of those funds, they worked on workforce development. That's my understanding, sort of anecdotally, not necessarily strategically. But we did actually put some other resources into workforce development, as separate and apart from Measure 110 resources. Yes.
I mean, we do have a whole team doing workforce development with funding that our legislature has supported. But I will go back specifically on the marijuana tax, because that I don't have the answer for right here.
Right. And I think, Rob, were you looking at the slide that basically talks about determining cost of workforce? Because I think that it was cost of building the pipeline, or were you looking at something else when you mentioned the cost of employing?
slide for that.
So I don't have the access to the slide, but what I was looking at was there was a breakdown of salaries and benefits and then the total employee costs. And one example was the salary was 68,000 and the benefits were 88,000, and that just seemed upside down.
Oh, I think it looks to me like it's with benefits.
It's not, it's a combined number. They combine benefits and salaries to come up with the total cost of the employee.
Yeah, that could be. And I don't know if that benefits necessarily, can't be just benefits. It probably includes overall like
Benefits and.
indirect rates and all of that kind of thing within an agency. or
Supervision
something
that
like
goes into
supervision
it.
and all of those different things. I can't imagine that it's not, it can't be just benefits. Benefits are usually about a
Health
third.
insurance.
Yeah, they're about a third above the actual cost. I would imagine that because I had that question too, like what does it cost to actually build that infrastructure within an entire agency to do that work? So you may be able to employ 4 or 5 different addiction specialists, CADCs, and or nurses and or physicians and or people who are a part of a larger system. But what does it cost overall for that entire system, which is that indirect rate, whatever that indirect rate is? That, what does that include? The building? Does that include the, all of the other infrastructure type pieces that goes within them? That's my assumption about what that looks like. I don't know that. But guess also says admin and program support. That's a very interesting number. I'd be curious as to.
And I will, bring back the questions. We can hopefully get answers to some of the questions now that I can pass to Rosie. So you have it before the April presentation.
Okay.
So if there are other questions, please pass them forward. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm interested in getting the answer to that question too, because that's a thought.
Yeah.
Today.
One comment for Salazar, that's a great point about increasing labor costs. I totally agree with you on our side of the aisle too. It's been rough. We've seen massive hikes in labor costs and packaging and materials and transportation. Everything's crazy since the pandemic. But a question for just the quantities of laborers that you were looking at. Is that derived from the gap analysis report, or where are those figures coming? Okay.
So some of this is an overlay of the gap analysis report as well.
Okay. And will we get an opportunity to kind of dig into the gap analysis report to kind of go through the metrics by how we're determining what our demand is? Since that seems to be a pretty big component of, trying to fund it, is to see, understanding how we're coming to those numbers.
So, sorry, just wanted to.
Basically, what is the gap?
Yeah.
The gap analysis is looking at what our theoretical demand is. And I would love just a little bit more detail on how we got to that demand figure so that we can better understand and making sure this is like staffing for the needs that we right level of need.
Adam is gonna pull up that determining cost workforce wages, because we're looking at this. The CRM, CMHA and CMHP numbers look right in terms of the benefits, but the JDC and the CPS numbers look really odd comparatively speaking. So I just wanted to ask about that. Can you see that sort of that percentage of 21 for CHMP 21,772, like that looks like a decent number for a benefits package.
I'm sorry.
In terms of the benefit line, if you take a look at the benefit line under each one of those pieces.
Yeah.
You got 15,000, 12,000 and 21,000, but on the CADCs and the CPS, they're huge. Yeah, that doesn't make sense. I wonder if that's just a bit of a typo.
Yeah.
Don't know.
I don't know.
Okay.
I have it down to ask specifically about,
Yeah, because the other ones look like more within line to what they could be or should be. So that may be just a detail messed up a little bit. So, all right, I just want to clarify that piece. I think that's important to recognize that the other numbers look like more doable situations. Okay. Any other questions, thoughts? Because we're rolling down to our last 5 minutes here today, folks. Comment? Yeah, this was quick. Good. Okay, fabulous. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
I'll see you all in April, and
Yes.
let me know if there are questions before.
I'm sure we probably have a few questions before that. I have, taken a few notes myself. Again, want to encourage people to take a look at the overall questions that we all answered and just sort of read through that and sort of see where things are. Again, encouraging you also to take a deeper dive into the reports. I think those are hugely important for us. First, to all be on the same page on what it is we're looking at, because maybe it's a little bit further than, apples to apples, or in any kind of way. We have to really pay attention to this. I think there's balance in here somewhere, and I really appreciate folks bringing as much information as they can forward to help us come to some really good, final conversation. And I'm gonna just say, since nobody else looks like they're popping up to answer any questions online and anything, my God, we can give you 4 minutes of your day. You're adjourned.